Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's really exciting to be here. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things we do at Vanderbilt to build sustainability across the whole university, to bring in the whole range of all the disciplinary knowledge and skills that people have, applying it to teaching, scholarship, and artistic expression to respond to environmental change. And before I get started on that, this is particularly for the students, for the early career people here. A lot of people are saying only a few people can participate. You might not belong. You might not belong because of who you are. But you belong here. If your passion is science, any kind of science, you belong in science. If your passion is the arts, you belong in arts. If your passion is activism, politics, organizing, you belong there. Whatever your role is, wherever your passion takes you in making the world more sustainable and just, you belong, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So, I want to start a little kind of overview here. I want to talk a little bit about narrative because I think narrative is really important when we talk about climate change. One reason, there are many reasons, but one reason we care so much about climate change is how it affects people. But there's an old saying, some people attribute it to Stalin: if one person dies of hunger, it's a tragedy. If millions die, it's statistics. It's the specific stories. It's bringing specific voices of people and communities that are affected by climate change that make it real. 2 degrees Celsius of global warming means nothing to most people. There is no visceral experience of 2-degree change in the average temperature of the planet. But when you start talking about how people, how communities, this person, their family, their community are affected, that gets people, oh, now I get it. I see what this is. I care about that. And when we try to do something about it, sustainability and resilience are all about human choices and behaviors. If we don't understand the way people think and the way they behave, we're going to make bad policy. I'm a computer modeler. When I'm modeling systems that include the environment and people, I have to think about the people there. And I think of every model I program is a story. Somewhere in there, there's a narrative of what the human meaning is, of what my little simulated people are doing in my model. If I get that human meaning wrong, my model is useless. So stories are going to matter. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a lot of us at Vanderbilt, this isn't just me, I'm representing an institution that we've done a lot of cool stuff on interdisciplinary work on climate change and sustainability. Back in 2006, I got together with a professor of law, and we started the Climate Change Research Network to connect law and policy with the natural science and engineering about climate change and clean energy, but also social sciences and behavioral sciences, because making good policy, we realized, means we need to know how people behave. How are people going to respond to regulations or incentives? And then in 2012, we established an Institute for Energy and Environment. We hired George Hornberger, shown here, very distinguished hydrologist, to lead it. And more than his skills at hydrology and computer modeling, George taught us how to build community. He set up a welcoming institute that had a weekly meeting where for an hour people from all over the university, from literature, philosophy, sociology, political science, environmental science, engineering, even the divinity school would come in. People from the community who cared about sustainability would come in, and we'd sit around and have an hour a week of informal conversation, get to know each other, talk about what we were interested in, talk about projects we're working on, and we got to know the way each other think, and we built a lot of trust there. And as we learned to communicate and work together, we started to see how we could bring different perspectives to bear and start interdisciplinary research projects. And so we ended up, over the course of about 8 years, bringing in over $20 million in external funding and leaving a lasting imprint on the university. So then in 2020, I realized we were having conversations with people in humanities and the arts, but we weren't engaging as deeply as I hoped we would. We had these great collaborations with sociologists, political scientists, economists working with climate scientists and engineers. We could engage better with the humanities and the arts. So I started this grand challenge to say, let's bring the humanities and the arts more thoroughly into this. And one of the big things that came out of this is we launched a new interdisciplinary undergraduate major in climate studies, where students learn about climate change with natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities all getting equal emphasis. And this is a rapidly growing major. After 2 years, it had 65 majors, which is a lot for a new major in Vanderbilt, and it continues to grow rapidly. We've done a lot of hiring, both tenure-track and non-tenure-track faculty, and we're also supporting 5 environmental humanities postdocs who are doing teaching and scholarship, working on their book projects, and getting a lot of professional guidance and career development so they'll go out and set the world on fire. Last fall, we launched a new Center for Sustainability, Energy, and Climate. And again, the leadership that designed this center included people from all over campus. And so we focus on 4 problem areas shown here: risks, resource sustainability, climate change, and energy. And then we approach them. The arrows illustrate different disciplinary perspectives: governance and policy, environmental and health impacts, human behavior, workforce development and education, and technology. But we're not just doing that, we're also collaborating with other institutes on campus. We're working with our Center for the Humanities, we're working with our Center for Art, Enterprise, and Public Policy to do really cool things that really cross lots of different ways of thinking about the environment. So to kind of go into a little depth here then, on one project, this is something I've been very deeply involved in. Paula Pasalagua here was part of a collaboration that was part of this. We do this interdisciplinary research in Bangladesh, and what's interesting is this started from teaching. We were teaching an interdisciplinary graduate seminar on water and social justice in Bangladesh. Down here on the bottom, here I am with my colleague Brooke Ackerley, a political scientist, Steve Goodbread, a sedimentologist, and we taught this seminar on water and social justice in Bangladesh. We got some money to bring our students over to Bangladesh and spend a week getting our students together with Bangladeshi students and professors, traveling around the country, looking at environmental change and how this was affecting communities and people there. And this was such an exciting thing for us and our students that we said, hey, can we get some money to actually do research projects on this? So we were fortunate that we brought a big grant from the Office of Naval Research to launch this, and subsequently have gotten several NSF grants to carry it forward. And we collaborate on this now with a bunch of universities around the world. The top, this is part of our research team at the end of one of our field seasons. And so one piece of this, looking at extreme weather, human impacts, and migration. My colleagues Catherine Donato, who's now at Georgetown, Amanda Carrico, who's now at University of Colorado Boulder, launched the Bangladesh Environmental and Migration Survey, where they go to households, interview the head of the household, and collect retrospectively the whole history of every time anybody in that household has left their village, gone somewhere else in search of work or health care or other reasons that they've migrated. And over the course of the years, they've collected data, over 2,000 variables from each household, from about 5,700 households in 29 villages that you can see illustrated here on the map. So this is a huge database. And one of the things we did with it is say, hey, marriage is a big issue. Bangladesh, since the 1980s, has been trying to promote women's rights, education and literacy for girls, and moving away from an old tradition where girls would get married at or even maybe a little before puberty. They would be pulled out of school. They would never have a chance to really develop any kind of autonomy, economic agency. They would basically be put in a subservient role in a household and have very little power over their lives. If girls stayed in school, if they had a chance to go work outside the home, they would have much more agency in their lives, much better quality of life. And so we were interested in how extreme weather, heat waves and droughts, affect marriage at early ages. So using our surveys, which told us about when girls got married and young women got married, we analyzed meteorological data to look at heat waves and drought in each of the 29 villages that the survey was conducted in and connect that to the marriage. And so what we found right here on the upper right is showing that for girls 11 to 14, 15 to 17, and young women 18 to 23, for each of these, the longer a heat wave goes on, the more likely they are to get married later that year or the next year. So we start to see that extreme weather driven by climate change leads to more marriage at young ages, but also it affects the quality of the family they marry into. The more extreme, a heat wave here, moving more extreme, or a drought here, the lower the socioeconomic status of the husband, the less education the husband gets. Again, less education for the husband, and husband is more likely to express support for intimate partner violence. So now we see a connection between climate change and exposure to domestic violence. So these are the kinds of connections that we're able to make through this research, connecting many disciplines together. Another piece of this by graduate student Kelsey Best, now a professor at Ohio State, used computer modeling to study how extreme weather affects migration when people leave their villages and go somewhere else in search of jobs. And so she uses a method called pattern-oriented agent-based modeling that begins with looking at the empirical literature and say, are there distinctive patterns that we see in migration, and can we write a computer model that will replicate those patterns and then look at what kind of assumptions have to go into the model so that the simulation matches reality. That probably tells us something about what's really going on. So we used a paper, classic paper by Clark Gray and Valerie Mueller on migration from rural villages in Bangladesh, where they found migration, if a flood comes in and washes away people's homes, that doesn't make them that much more likely to migrate. But if it kills the crops in the field so they lose their crop, then they're more likely to move away in search of other opportunities. And they found two distinctive patterns. One is what's called a threshold effect. As more and more of the community is affected by the disaster, you actually find fewer and fewer people migrating away until you hit a threshold when a certain fraction of the community, around 20%, is affected. And then above that, as more than 20% of the community is affected, the more extensive the disaster is, the more people migrate away. And so we look for that threshold effect, and we look for another pattern that the households that are affected directly, the ones who lose their crops, are less likely to move away than other households in the community that were spared. So if I lose my crops, I'm less likely to move away than my neighbor whose crops did all right. So we make a model and we say, can it reproduce both of these patterns, and what assumptions have to go into it to make that so? So our model simulates villages with agricultural and non-agricultural livelihoods like fishing or collecting timber from the forests. Households with farmland grow rice, and then they may hire people to work on their fields. Other people will go and seek work as wage laborers on farm fields, and we have a simulated labor market that matches supply and demand. And so when a disaster happens, some households lose their crops. They can't feed themselves. So now they're going and looking for work on other people's land. As long as not too many people lose their crops, that's great. There's a lot of employment opportunity. But as more and more and more households lose their crops, fewer people are hiring farm workers, more people are looking for work, and this starts to drive that out migration. We compared two different models of decision-making. One is a purely economic one, that the households are just trying to maximize their expected utility. Are we going to get more money in the household if we send somebody to go to the city and get a job and send remittances back to the village, or if they stay here to work? The other is a more psychologically complex model that's widely used in social psychology called the theory of planned behavior. And we thought the psychologically complex model would do a better job of explaining these patterns. But we were wrong. The economic model actually worked best. We took all the parameters for this model from the empirical survey work. So this is all just using the real numbers from the field. These aren't things that we can freely tweak, except for two parameters that we didn't measure. One of these is the cost of migration. How much does it cost to actually travel to a distant place, find a place to live, find a job? There's real cost in that. The other is what's the expected value that the household expects to get from the migrant going away, finding a job, and sending money back. And so what we did is we don't know the value of these, so we figured some plausible ranges that are shown here. The range of expected utility, the range of the cost of migration, and we randomly picked pairs of values in here, ran the model 100 times for each of these points on the chart, and then the green dots are the ones where the model robustly, so for the 100 runs, it would reproduce both of the patterns at once, and the orange dots were where it failed. Then we used machine learning techniques to draw this line and say there's this whole region here where any values of the parameters in this region are likely to match both of the observed patterns at the same time. The orange region, not so much. And so 91% of all the samples we tried succeeded in reproducing both of these patterns. So it says this doesn't depend on the details of exactly what the cost of migration or the expected utility is. Over this wide range of values, our model is really robust. But here's what was cool. This only worked if our model accurately represented the economic inequality of the households. How much land did different households own? If we used what's called a Pareto distribution of land ownership that we calibrated with the empirical Gini coefficient that measures inequality from our surveys, this model worked fabulously. Here's the threshold effect. As the fraction of the community affected by disaster goes from 0 to 1, you see migration falling up until 20%, and then it starts to rise, just like the research found in the field. But if we use a different form of the distribution of land, a log normal instead of a Pareto distribution, or if we use a Pareto distribution, but the Gini coefficient is much smaller than what we observe in our surveys, the model sucks. It's really hard. We almost can't get it to reproduce both of those patterns. So this is telling us, deep level, the kind and degree of economic inequality in the villages is really fundamental to the patterns of migration that occur in response to disasters. This is really important. But Kelsey didn't just do computer models. She also got a small grant from the university to do a project called Our Land is in the River Now, where she worked with a professor at the University of Dhaka in the capital city to collect migration stories from residents of an urban settlement, turned those stories along with her research into a bilingual interactive story web on the map. These QR codes will take you to the English language and the Bangla language versions of this. And she took care to present the stories in the way that the storytellers wanted the world to see them. So another research project in Bangladesh looking at the potential impact of sea level rise. This is from a 1995 report, and what you often see is this kind of depiction of, this is a very flat, low-lying deltaic plain on a coast. If the sea level rises 1.5 meters, you just draw a contour 1.5 meters up on the coast and assume all this area, about 16% of the country is going to get flooded, and 17 million people will have to be displaced because their homes are underwater. But the problem is when the sea level rises, the land doesn't just stay fixed. This is a very dynamic environment. The rivers flowing into the Bay of Bengal bring 1 billion tons of sediment every year. And you can see here in the satellite photo all this silt suspended in the water, being carried by the currents, worked by the tides up into these tidal channels. And when the high tide goes up above the land, It's bringing that suspended sediment that gradually settles down and piles up on the land surface, raising it up. So over the course of days, months, years, the tides going up on the land add material, they add mud and silt that raises the level of the land. So my student Chris Tosic developed a computer model of the sediment dynamics, saying what happens with sea level rise if we account for the fact that the tides coming up on the land are bringing mud and silt. And so what he found is here, you see the blue lines. This blue line is the mean high water, the average high tide. The top one is the mean spring high water, the really high spring tides that happen twice a month. The green is the level of the land. And here, simulated over 120 years with sea level rise, raising the level of the water, the land rises in equilibrium, always staying basically a little bit above the mean high water. And this means then with good land use, it's possible to use controlled flooding with these natural processes of sediment transport to maintain the delta so almost no land might get lost as the sea level rises over the coming century. And Chris looked in more detail at this, looking at what happens when you change parameters: slow, medium, rapid sea level rise, from no sediment up to a lot of sediment and different levels of high tide. Everywhere with the yellow, the land remains robustly above the mean high tide. But when you get to low sediment and rapid sea level rise, you get into these blue regions where the land ends up below the high tide level, and in this little red triangle where you have very fast sea level rise and very little sediment, the whole thing goes kerblooey, the equilibrium breaks down, and the land ends up very far underwater. And so we have a little bit of warning is these large yellow areas say it's really possible for Bangladesh to keep that delta sustainable under high rates of sea level rise as long as it gets enough sediment. But the Indian Rivers Interlinking Project that India wants to do to divert rivers may remove about a third of all the sediment, and that could potentially threaten the survivability of the delta. But that's just the technical part of it. If we want to use land use management and controlled flooding to protect the delta, we have to talk to the people whose land is going to be flooded. They have a say in this, and they have a lot of opinions. If a farmer's going to lose their ability to grow rice for 2 years because the land's going to be flooded temporarily, that might make things good in the long run, but how are they going to feed their family now? And when these controlled flooding projects have been done as a grassroots thing led by the community, it's been successful and popular. But when the government brought its engineers and civil servants in to force this on communities that didn't want it, it was met with resistance. In 2012, May of 2012, I was going into Jashore to meet with the head of an NGO and ran into a whole lot of heavily armed police. I later found that that day, these are photographs from a photojournalist reporting in a local newspaper, a member of parliament had been visiting a village to talk about how they were going to force this controlled flooding on them, and the villagers didn't like this. They attacked the motorcade, burned 9 vehicles, about 50 people were severely injured in the fighting. And so you got to talk to the people. The Asian Development Bank, reviewing why this project failed, said there was no buy-in from local communities, and the engineers and bureaucrats doing this had a lack of understanding of an indigenous knowledge base. People living in the villages know a lot about the environment of those villages that engineers 100 miles away may not. A local farmer interviewed by my research assistant said the government engineer would not accept our suggestion because he thought it was given by the non-experts. So future directions here, we're looking to combine this sediment model with narratives that I collected during my field work several years ago and develop a model of community politics and decision-making that'll let us explore how different kinds of controlled flooding policies can either exacerbate or relieve conflict within the communities. And again, graduate student supplement projects. Chelsea Peters, one of George Hornberger's students, got a small grant to turn her dissertation research into a children's book called Farjana's Journey. Here is a page from this illustrating the processes of controlled flooding to raise the land from here to here and protect the village. She worked with Bangladeshi and U.S. students to illustrate it and translate it into Bangla, printed up hundreds of copies of the books, and distributed them to elementary schools in the region where she had done her dissertation research so that the children could learn the geologic history of the land they live on. Another area of my work, now totally different, this is something I've been doing for about 20 years with my colleague Mike Vandenberg, a law professor who used to be chief of staff at the Environmental Protection Agency, looking at how climate policy can be informed by social and behavioral sciences. And one of the big things we've looked at is we've developed a theory of what we call private environmental governance, where you might have noticed state and local governments have been trying and failing for 40 years to impose serious regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. has been trying since the 1980s, but has failed to actually enact laws to allow the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. When the government fails to take action, private actors, corporations, NGOs, community organizations, even individuals can take action that matters. And one part we're looking at is where private actors do things that function in the same way as government regulations. And one of the places we see this is corporate supply chain contracting. If you are a company who wants to sell goods at Walmart, you want your product on the shelves so somebody will buy it at Walmart, Walmart is going to insist that your company give an environmental impact statement, and they will twist your arm to reduce the environmental impact of manufacturing that project. In 2015, it was estimated that Walmart and Target were doing more to regulate the use of toxic chemicals in manufacturing than the federal government was. And it's not just Walmart. More than 300 of the world's largest corporate buyers are imposing supply chain contract requirements on their suppliers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is important because for the average large company, their supply chain produces 26 times more greenhouse gas emissions than the direct operations of the corporation do. So this is a place of using contracts as a way for corporations to act as regulators. We also look at voluntary actions by individuals and households. So here's an interesting one. Energy-efficient light bulbs, LEDs and compact fluorescents, save money. You replace the 5 light bulbs you use the most in your home with LEDs, and you'll save about $75 a year and reduce your energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Back in the early 2000s, Walmart took a lead in saying, this is great. We could sell a lot of energy-efficient light bulbs and people would benefit and it would help the environment. But at the time, it was really difficult and inconvenient to get energy-efficient light bulbs. They cost a lot of money. Walmart worked with suppliers to produce reliable, inexpensive, energy-efficient light bulbs and really pushed them by giving them prominent place on their shelves. In the first year, in the first 10 months of this project in 2007, they sold over 100 million light bulbs. Now they've sold well over 1 billion. And the economist Lucas Davis at the University of California found from 1930 to the early 2000s, every year, the per capita residential electricity consumption in the U.S. kept going up, just like here. Per capita residential energy consumption just rising like a line. I started in 1990, but this trend really starts back in the 30s, so 70 years. Then around 2007, around the time that Walmart launches its big initiative on energy-efficient light bulbs, you start to deviate, and this flattens out, and then around 2010, right around the time Walmart and other companies launch a new initiative on making even better energy-efficient light bulbs even more cheaply, this starts to come down. And I took this data and calculated the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, And from where we would be if we'd followed the trend to where we were in 2020 is a difference of about 130 million tons of carbon dioxide per year just by making it easy for people to buy energy-efficient light bulbs for their homes. And there's a lot more that people can do. Mariah Caballero, who's just finishing up her PhD, she'll be a professor at Wellesley College next fall, did some work on studying emissions reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that were passed in 2021 and 2022, and found that 11% of the spending under those acts combined goes towards incentives for people to reduce energy consumption at home, buying heat pump heaters instead of gas furnaces, buying electric vehicles, or just putting better insulation on their homes. But that 11% of the spending results in 40% of the expected cumulative emissions reductions. Here's the whole combined emissions reductions from the policies, and this lower one is the household contribution. So understanding human behavior and the way that people respond to incentives is really important for making good policy. So this is where I get to the really fun part of connecting arts and science. Two poets I really admire, James Merrill, truly great American poet, had a rather jaundiced view of art and science. Poems of science, ugh, the very thought. To squint through those steel-rimmed glasses of the congenitally slug-pale boy at school with his precipitates, his fruit flies, and his slide rule. Notice how white and male Merrill thinks science is. And what good is science to the artist? Why couldn't science in the long run serve as well as one's uncleared lunch table or Madame X en culotte de matador? Man, by nature, was, I'm paraphrasing, ignorant. The man of science knew little, could therefore be enticed to learn. So science is basically this thing, it's about like a bunch of fruit and dishes scattered on a lunch table for a still life. Jakob Bronowski, not nearly as good a poet as Merrill, but a brilliant mathematician as well, had a much more interesting view. When Coleridge tried to define beauty, he returned always to one deep thought. Beauty, he said, is unity in variety. Science is nothing else than the search to discover unity in the wild variety of nature, or more exactly, in the variety of our experience. Poetry, painting, the arts are the same search, in Coleridge's phrase, for unity in variety. Each in its own way looks for likenesses under the variety of human experience. What is a poetic image but the seizing and exploration of a hidden likeness in holding together two parts of a comparison, which are to give depth each to the other? So science and art are peers. They're doing the same thing in different ways with different subject matter, but they have a lot to say to each other, and they can learn from each other, and they can collaborate together. So what are we doing with this? Well, one thing we're doing is we're bringing team teaching to connect science and engineering with humanities and the arts. I teach a class called Drowning Cities with my colleague Betsy Robinson, an archaeologist and scholar of the architecture of ancient Greek cities. And we teach a class called Drowning Cities, where we look across the entire Holocene for the past 10,000 years. Why and how did the major settlements tend to all rise along coasts or major rivers? And what happened over that time as natural climate change and anthropogenic climate change causes the rivers to change, causes the sea level to rise, causes New Orleans to get flooded? And looking at this from the perspective of archaeology, art history, and science, the students really get a lot out of this. My colleague Lily Claiborne, a volcanologist, teaches a class with Jonathan Waters, a cinema professor, on exploring geological thinking through cinema, looking at storytelling and documentary filmmaking as ways to understand the geosciences. My colleague Chris Vonig's here from our education school has a public outreach project called Soil Ecologies and Environment. They're looking at how vegetation, the root structure of plants, the microbes in the soil affect the way that carbon gets stored in the soil. So they have a community science project where they'll mail out simple white cotton briefs, underpants, to people. They'll bury them outside, dig them up after 60 days, take photographs like you see here to assess the degree of decomposition, and you'll learn a lot about the health of the soil. So this has been done. People all across the state of Tennessee have been doing this to assess the health of the soil. Chris has also launched the Smart Meadow project in Vanderbilt, where we took a small meadow on campus, instrumented it with monitors for the weather, for soil moisture, using sensors contributed by the University of Colorado that monitor soil microbial activity. Biologists are doing genetic analyses of the flora and the fauna in the soil. There's a digital phenocam, a camera that takes photographs that record the seasons as leaves bloom and turn green and then turn colors and fall off. But they're also bringing art onto the meadow. Jonathan Ratner, showed here in the back, and Molly Barth here, a professor. Jonathan's a professor of cinema and media arts. Molly's a professor of flute performance. Jonathan takes video and digital synthesizers out to the meadow, wires them up to the plants, and monitors electrical impulses in the plants and uses those to drive video and music synthesis. And here they are doing an indoor performance. Jonathan's got like potted plants with his gizmos, and Molly is playing the flute. And so this is like, let's connect this to all kinds of wild artistic expressions. Angus Galloway, a professor of studio art, took his advanced drawing classes, had them really learn about the ecology of the meadow, and then do semester projects of self-portraits in the context of the meadow environment, and also worked on having the students make paper inspired by the plants in the meadow. We bring this to theater. Leah Lowe, the former chair of the theater department and the director of our Curb Center for Art Enterprise and Public Policy, launched what she calls the Eco-Grief Project. And this started in 2017. She was teaching a course, The Art of Social Justice, and the students were doing artistic responses to all kinds of big problems in society. But when they got to climate change, they kind of shut down. They were so overwhelmed by what the climate change made them feel that they couldn't express themselves. One student said, "I'm so anxious, I can't talk about it." So she said, we need better artistic outlets for people to express and experience the grief that they feel about ecological loss. And so she launched a competition for one-act plays about ecological grief. Playwrights from all over the country submitted, and out of 276 proposals, they selected 4 for full development, commissioned plays. The playwrights interacted with students and faculty and developed these plays, which were produced last fall. In producing them, they paid attention to sustainability in the use of materials in the set, prop, and costume design. Simultaneously, separate from the plays, the Curb Center also hosted Extraction Interaction, artist residencies and an artistic exhibit with Eliza Evans, who uses art and activism to engage with communities that are affected by fracking. John Sabra, who works in Carbondale, Ohio, with engineers who are cleaning up environmental damage from acid mine runoff coming from an abandoned coal mine, and using that as they are neutralizing the acid mine runoff, using that to make artistic pigments for paint. Will Wilson, a photographer who's looking at the impact on indigenous communities in the Southwest from abandoned uranium mines. So one of these plays, this was an absolutely amazing performance. Kristen Idijak's play, Blue Blood, Red Knot. The actors here, Paige Givens in the red, and Paige also here in the pith helmet. You can't see it so well, but she's wearing this beautiful metal mesh representation of a horseshoe crab shell. And Brianna Dahl playing a young woman called Violet, who discovers she's got a congenital heart condition. She's got to take medicine to keep her heart beating regularly, and later she has to get a pacemaker implanted to keep her heart going. And both the medicine she takes and the pacemaker have to be, to ensure that those are safe, that they're not going to poison her or make her sick. They're tested with the blood of horseshoe crabs, which is a unique substance on Earth for sensitively detecting bacterial toxins. The pharmaceutical industry relies on this. Horseshoe blood costs about $15,000 a quart, and 1 million horseshoe crabs a year are harvested for their blood. They try to draw the blood and return them back to nature, but about a third of them die from the trauma. And so Violet learns about this and builds a relationship with a horseshoe crab who she rescues from a lab. And here they are taking a road trip to the beach and talking. And the horseshoe crab is accusing Violet of saying, you know, our species have been here for hundreds of millions of years. We were here long before dinosaurs were on the earth. But you only care about us because our blood is valuable for keeping you alive. Don't we have any other value? And then here's Paige playing a red knot, a shorebird wearing, you can't see it so well, but she's wearing this beautiful kind of thing on her head that's got these orbs with a bird in it. The red knot is a shorebird that eats the eggs from horseshoe crabs. And in a healthy ecosystem, the red knot and the blue-blooded horseshoe crab can coexist very nicely. But as human land use is encroaching on the habitat, and as climate change is affecting this, the red knots eating the eggs of the horseshoe crabs is meaning both of these species may not be able to survive. We may have to choose which one survives. And this adds to the ecological anxiety and grief. And at the end of the play, the audience comes up to the stage bringing pieces of paper on which they've written one thing they want the world to know about them. So as we go from the visibility of these other species to bringing the visibility of the audience and the desire to be seen and recognized, that closes it. Now, one last thing that I participated in when I was on sabbatical at the University of Calgary last year was the Youth Anti-Racism and Integration Project, led by Pallavi Banerjee, a professor of sociology, and Pratim Sengupta, a professor of education, where they were working with young people, mostly high school students, who had recently come to Canada as immigrants or refugees, using art to help them understand Canadian society, understand how they could find a place in Canadian society, but also helping them understand and preparing them to resist structural racism in Canada. I worked together with some young people who wanted to do a project on this is like the summer before I came. There were these horrendous wildfires that burned over 5,000 square miles of forest in Alberta, and the city of Calgary was filled with just nasty smoke. It was dangerous and unhealthy to breathe. So I worked with these two young men, Adaman and Esnit, who both had recently come from Ivory Coast and were interested in making an animated video about the wildfires. And they got really interested in the way that global warming was making the winters warmer, so cold winters were not killing off insects, and insect infestations would damage the trees and make them more vulnerable to fire. So here's some of their artwork. Esnit in particular was a really talented artist, but this was a concept that Adiman came up with. He sketched this insect that looks kind of like an elephant with tusks and a trunk, and we asked him, Adiman, why are you making this insect that looks like an elephant? We gave it the Latin name Elephantus adamani. And he said, look, I see this ecological damage to the forest in Alberta. And I remember when I was in Ivory Coast, the forests are being cut back. The elephants are losing their habitat, and the elephants in Ivory Coast may go extinct. And I'm seeing this connection between the loss of forest habitat in both places. So these are a few stills from their movies of the insect infestations, cars releasing carbon dioxide that's going in the air and warming the planet, the fires. And then they also drew on climate science to understand where wildfires were happening in Canada and what was the scientific basis for saying there's a connection. So, the lessons learned from all these different things I've talked about. Deeply interdisciplinary collaboration takes time. You have to build trust. If I'm talking with artists, I'm talking with social scientists, I'm out of my comfort zone, and I make myself very vulnerable by saying, hey, these are cool ideas, let me try them out. I'm probably going to get them wrong, and somebody could really humiliate me if they want. It was mentioned in the introduction I wrote a play. One of the most emotionally intense times in my life was sitting down for the first table read of my play with a bunch of professional actors who were way out of my league. These were good people. And we had the table read, and they started asking questions about the play. And I'd made a bunch of, what first-time playwrights make mistakes. There were things there. Instead of humiliating me, they're like, okay, we know a bunch of stuff. We're going to help you do this. And we had a week of just intensive workshopping where I learned so much. But this was a very vulnerable place, and they could have just squashed my ambitions right there. So, trust. You establish a common language. You learn how to talk to each other. You share your conceptual and theoretical ways of thinking about the world. Metaphors are important. Metaphors turn out to be really important, not just for art, but scientists think in metaphors. And when you want to understand how somebody in a different discipline thinks, you need to understand their metaphors. And then you figure out shared metaphors. And you learn how to apply that shared understanding to creating new approaches to problem solving. But incentives matter because people are busy. Participating in this kind of community building takes time and effort away from other things that people do. And do universities adequately reward this? Does your discipline, does your department reward collaborative research? This is something that's really created a barrier to getting humanities people working with scientists and engineers. Scientists and engineers love collaborating. It's very rewarded on. You don't get a lot of recognition for collaborative work in the humanities, so you have to figure out how you work together when people have different reward structures. And same with team teaching and developing creative new courses. Are you going to get credit for all the work that you put into developing a new course in team teaching? And risk tolerance. Early career people have to really focus on being productive, getting that scholarship out that's going to get them to the next point in their career. And can they afford to invest in these long-term collaborations that may take years to pay off? But to end on a nice note, art and storytelling play a central role. When we feel fear, uncertainty, grief, and despair, art gives us ways to give voice to our thoughts and feelings. And this matters to scientists just as much as to anyone else. Art gives us a way to communicate with the public, but it also gives us vision for how we move forward. And science and art working together have untapped potential for understanding and transforming the world. And this is a painting by John Sabra that was exhibited at Vanderbilt using pigments that he produced from the acid mine drainage. So thank you for your attention, and I would be really happy to answer questions, have some discussion, whatever. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for giving us a chance to ask questions. Wonderful storytelling you were doing there. And one thing that stood out to me, the Bangladesh story was especially impactful. One of my colleagues, she just joined so I'm in the civil engineering program, in the PhD program, and I'm focused on sustainable systems engineering. She's came from Bangladesh, and I would like to share with her the article that the Rivers article, the story that you shared, because I think she would like that. But on the Walmart story, something that I have a slight qualm with is that if I understood correctly, you said Walmart had more of an incentive for more energy efficient light bulbs than the government regulations. But if I recall correctly, in 2007, there was the Energy Independence and Security Act passed by the government, which was a mandatory requirement of having manufacturers and producers to produce more efficient light bulbs, which indirectly required Walmart to invest more time in selling those more efficient light bulbs. So I think it's a combination.
I'm so glad you raised that, because it's like some of the things I'm talking about I had to condense for time. So Walmart started its project in 2005 because it had to spend a couple of years working with manufacturers to produce these efficient light bulbs. Then it had everything lined up, and as it led up in 2006, it said in 2007, we're going to sell 100 million energy-efficient light bulbs. During 2007, that Energy Independence and Job Security Act was passed to put a requirement on. So now something Walmart had done independently now had reinforcement from government policy. But Walmart was doing stuff first. This was great. Walmart was really happy with that government regulation because it fit well with what they were doing. Then a couple of years later, after the 2010 Tea Party takeover, where the Republicans controlled Congress, they pulled all the funding from enforcement of those energy efficiency rules. So now that law was on the books, but the government was officially saying, we're never going to enforce this. And it was after that that Walmart doubled down and said, we're going to try to make even better energy-efficient light bulbs and push those onto the shelves. So these private governance can work in partnership with public laws, but it can also kind of keep the momentum going when the public laws go away, and it can also get things started. So another thing related to that, I mentioned in 2015, it was found that Walmart and Target were regulating toxic substances in manufacturing more stringently than the government's Toxic Substance Control Act did. Partly, some of my law professor colleagues say that it was partly because of that, because private industry was regulating these things so much, that it was possible to pass in 2016 the Lautenberg amendments to the Toxic Substances Control Act that strengthened government regulation, and they were partly able to do that politically because people could say, look, private industry is already saying that this is possible without hurting profits. So this is why I don't think it's either or, but I think private governance and public governance can work in partnership. So that's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was so beautifully inspiring. I have a question with where we are right now in this state of the administration with a lot of funding being pulled and past programs that were made and those being pulled. What advice do you have or inspiration do you have within education and those of us perhaps doing collaborations outside of the university, seeking with what you had mentioned with incentives, particularly funding, and those maybe grants and other resources of funding that don't exist anymore? I think hopefully that was enough to go off of.
That's really hard. And I think it's going to be hard for all of us, for people in the universities who want government grants, for people outside the universities who are looking for funding. And it's not just the funding, but there's also just a lot of hostility and threat and fear that people feel. But sometimes this is where, for one thing, I think it's going to be important to look to foundations for support for things, especially for people outside of universities, looking to community things. I'm finding myself digging in more and more to what can I do within my community. And I see people working in the arts in my community, looking at arts as a very important way to respond and push back against the kinds of things people are doing. Art, interdisciplinary collaborations, any way of connecting with other people is also a part of building a movement that can be politically effective for change.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gilligan, for that really awesome presentation. I'm standing up just so that we can see each other. I'm really drawn to sort of the research that was going on about sea rise and the different sediment, accumulations that you would see. We're talking about it, I think, more in sort of this village, or I assume somewhat agrarian sort of context. I'm from New Orleans. I'm very interested in sort of this idea of what urban locations can do with these challenges. And you think about New Orleans, you think about Venice, you think about all these cities that were built on top of all these sediment, landscapes. And as they're urbanized, they don't have that replenishment of sediment necessarily. And so if you're thinking about this research, are there any learnings that you can share about coastal cities? And I don't know if there are any urban planners in here, but what they may consider as they engage civil engineers, ecologists, and others in a time of climate change.
Yeah, I don't have simple lessons to give, but I think this is really important. And one of the really rewarding things that I did as part of the teaching work that was associated with that work in Bangladesh, I talked about how we brought our students from the U.S. to Bangladesh. We also, in 2014, brought a bunch of students and professors from Bangladesh to come to the U.S., and we did a field trip down to southern Louisiana. We visited Houma, we visited Morgan City, we visited New Orleans, and we looked and we asked our Bangladeshi students, what do you see here? How does this compare to your landscapes at home? We think there's a real comparison, and I think the challenge of cities is really tough because what works in a rural area might work from an engineering perspective in an urban area, but you're not really going to do controlled flooding of large parts of New Orleans to address the subsidence. But you can learn about how you can constructively think about the sediment management for the wetlands that are kind of down towards the coast, down towards the bird foot, that those wetlands are being washed away because of mismanagement of sediment by channelizing the Mississippi River. And this is a place where you can say, hey, those wetlands are really important for protecting New Orleans from the force of storm surges and winds when the hurricanes come on land. So you can still learn something there. And this is a place where I'm going to give a plug for one of my favorite history books is John Barry's book, Rising Tide, is a brilliant history that encompasses the birth of the Army Corps of Engineers, the engineering of the Mississippi River, how engineering the Mississippi River affected flood risks in cities like New Orleans and other settlements along it, and then how the management of that river during the Great Flood of 1927 played a really pivotal role in race relations, racial justice in the U.S., the Great Northern Migration, and the shift of black voters from voting almost entirely for Republicans as the party of Lincoln to voting for Democrats as the party of Roosevelt. All of this, the environmental history, the engineering, the politics, the economics, and the race and the study of institutional racism all come together. And so part of the lesson, I think, from the Bangladesh work is don't just think about the engineering and the physical environment. Think about the politics, the economics, the history. When I teach about New Orleans, one of the really important things is talking about the cultural history of the lower Ninth Ward and why this is such an important community. So understanding how the people part fits in. And then, since we talk about arts in response directly after Hurricane Katrina and in the years since has become a really important political voice of people who felt they were left out of the conversation, trying to say, hey, we're here, we're shouting, listen to us.
Great, thank you. Well, we are at time, but thank you so much. That was a wonderful place to leave it. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Gilligan.